Welcome to the Tech Humanist Show, a multimedia format program exploring how data and technology shape the human experience. I'm your host, Kate O'Neill.
And there's theories that we started to emote musically, tonally, as Homo sapiens before we really had language, and that we found our way into shaping those into words. But before that, it was tones and gestures.
Hello, humans. I'm Kate O'Neill, and this is the Tech Humanist Show. Today, we're speaking with Craig Havighurst. He's a Nashville-based music journalist, author, and broadcaster who spent more than 25 years exploring how music works and why it matters. He's the music news director at WMOT Roots Radio and host of The String, and his new book, Musicality for Modern Humans: How to Listen Like an Artist, makes the case for deeper, more intentional listening in an age of algorithms, trend simulation, and AI-generated sound. Well, Craig, it's such a delight to have you here. I'm so tickled about having this conversation because I think so. First of all, music is such a fundamental part of the human experience. And so I think it's going to be really helpful to explore this. But first of all, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kate. It's great to see you. It's been a while. I miss you in Nashville.
Thanks. It's great to see you as well. And, of course, this is the Tech Humanist Show, and we'll get to the tech part in just a moment. But I thought, for starters, could you just talk about how you understand the relationship between music and being human?
That's a big one.
Just warm us up.
Well, I wanted that word human in the title. I wanted it to be forward. Humanism, the humanities. I was raised to value the humanities. I always loved that there was a word that bound together literature, theater, dance, music, art under this word that tells you why we're all here, and that it is such a powerful, and music specifically has emerged for me as somebody who does love literature and who does love art, but music has, for whatever reason, took over my life at an early age. Not to be a player, although I do play as an amateur. I'm a proud amateur musician. Did not want to go mix it up in the world of performance and try to make that my career. But I did latch on 30 years ago now almost to a posture where I could chronicle it as a journalist and investigate it at all levels, not just as a churning of who's new and who's hot in whatever genre I was covering, but as a kind of a tapestry of how we live, what kind of communities we build, and the history of music. I'm such a believer in context, and I'll talk about that in some other tech context later. But for me, music grew in my mind and my heart as I learned the stories of the people that made it, the stories of the people that promoted it and invented whole concepts like the Newport Jazz and Folk Festivals, just to name one out of the sky. The story of music is full of community builders, of connection makers, of leaders in a certain kind of politics, and certain then explicitly politics. Music fueled the civil rights movement. It's simple, and we have evidence that we've been doing it as human beings for at least tens of thousands of years. There's theories that we started to emote musically, tonally, as Homo sapiens before we really had language, and that we found our way into shaping those into words. But before that, it was tones and gestures, and really music is made of tones and gestures. So it's the biggest subject on earth for me, and maybe I've said it in about a minute and a half. I don't know, but it's
so I also wanted to give you an opportunity to either retell or allude to. It's a wonderful story you tell in the book about being 16 in the North Carolina All-State Youth Orchestra and feeling your whole body light up playing Strauss. So what does that moment tell you about what music does to us and for us?
I think I'd been primed for that epiphany by parents that took me to concerts. They are classical music people, especially opera and symphonic music, also chamber music. So I got to hear a lot of things. I was put into violin lessons at age 7, and the youth orchestra was a Saturday morning routine for years through my middle school, junior high, and into high school. And I didn't ever say, wow, I am going to be a musician because of this, or the violin is the be all end all. I want to get as great as possible. But I did, but seeds were being planted. And I think you get set up for moments when all things come together. And because I was in this orchestra that was a select group, and so there were high quality players, they were able to choose more challenging repertoire. And I don't even remember the other pieces that we played, but I remember that one piece, an orchestral suite from the Opera de Rosenkavalier. And it's from the 19th century, late 19th century. And just so it's a little bit harmonically adventurous, but mostly it was like lush and gorgeous. There's just this motion in the way that the chords shift and the layers stack up. And it was not being in an audience hearing it. It was, I'm playing my little part, and I'm one of many violins. And yet you can hear the whole mix. You can hear it. And so, yeah, I do remember this moment. I thought about it for years and thought I should get it chronicled, when it just kind of hit me in waves, like chills and hair standing up and just electrified. The kind of hormonal thing that's happening to teenagers anyway, but it was happening in the context of classical music without words. And so that's why I open with that anecdote, because so much of the book is to try to persuade people that we've been very attentive to and almost pushed toward an almost all song diet, and that music without words has, this incredible persuasion over our emotions. And it felt like the right anecdote to open up.
Yeah, it also, I love that you, in telling it just now, that you talk about, not being the only violin, but being part of this whole orchestra and part of this section of violins. And that feels like an allusion to the democratic nature of this, which, I'd love for you to take us through some of the definition of musicality, because you take in this book this word musicality, and it may, maybe that can sound a little insiderish, but you're stretching it into something that is much more democratic, and you're framing it as, sensitivity, awareness, and almost a kind of mindfulness about sound. So for someone listening who doesn't think of themselves as musical per se, how do you define musicality? And what does it matter that more of us see ourselves as capable of cultivating it?
Well, your read on the term as I used it was very astute. You caught all of both the dictionary definitions, the sort of a sensitivity and awareness of music, but I've called it, this is kind of nerdy, but a kind of a set of aptitudes, and some of them are specific to music, and some of them are broader. The specific things, people tend to get scared of music theory, but I try to talk about them as rules of a game that would help you as the way we understand the sports we love. And I remind people that they've been taught the rules of every major sport relentlessly over the broadcast and in the sports pages for their entire lives. We teach sports. We report on music. We show and present the finished product, but we almost never get in regular life opportunities to read or hear people talk about just the mechanics of chord progressions, how melody and harmony relate to each other. So there's the aptitudes of music as it is, just how it works, especially in our Western system. And I acknowledge that there are musical systems. Classical music is different in India. It's very advanced. Music is different in West Africa. But in our Western system, from pop to classical to jazz, we have those rules. And then there's a certain, I equate musicality with curiosity, with open-mindedness, with a seeking, lifelong learning mentality and attitude, because it's a great example of how music itself is a great example of how people tend to get locked in patterns in life and locked in certain eras of their life. And music is so marketed as nostalgic to us. and oldies for at some stretches has been like the biggest format of all radio. And we have these tours of people that are, very old, who made music, and the people that go are the people that loved them when they were 18 to 25 back in the day. And as I say, there's nothing wrong with that, but unless you are constantly updating your musical sort of base of what you're listening to, the genres, the traditions, the regions, and then there's just more human values that I think are baked into the way music is made. People who do sign up to be concert violinists or symphonic musicians in the timpani, in the percussion section, or the with their little part in a big thing, or a jazz musician who's part of a equal group of equals. Wynton Marsalis pretty much came up with the democratic metaphor for jazz ensembles, where each person gets a voice, but everybody supports that voice when the other is speaking as the soloist. So there's all these wonderful metaphors for how we live, and I think that I try to embrace all of that while teaching the basics of what music is made of.
And what you've just gone through, there's like two directions I want to go at the same time, so I have to decide which of those I want to pursue. But you also talk about the listening for versus listening to, which seems like a really important distinction that you draw in motions and layers and nuance and surprise. And you quote Aaron Copland about the ideal listener. Yeah, okay. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, he wrote a book in 1939, How to Listen to Great Music, or it might be even called What to Listen For in Great Music. I can't even recall. It's up there on the shelf. But he does a nice couple of paragraphs about how the attentive listener, the listener who's going to grow and really get something out of music, is listening for elements of motion, listening for dynamics, listening for certain closures and openings, so transitions. They're listening for a kind of larger arc of a piece of music. And of course, he's talking about only classical music, but this applies to a pop song, anything. It was just great. So I pulled what I thought were the best bits from him and then added my own notions of what we could be listening for and try to set the reader up in chapter 1. That's where that phrase, where I make that argument that music is about listening for things in the music and not just the passivity of listening to and letting it flow while you do something else. We're always going to have passive listening in our lives. Don't get me wrong. All of us. And having music on in the background is cool. But in a world where we're kind of always on the go with our earbuds in, and music has become kind of an attendant to travel more than almost anything else, in us being in motion, or we're at a concert and people listen intently at a concert. I think we've definitely lost a lot of the attention to music at home, where we have our own choice of what to listen to, how to set the volume, how to go and get a snack when you feel like, you have all this freedom to indulge in music at home. And I'd love to talk later about some of the tools. The technology has evolved to support that, but we're not taking advantage of it much. So listening for is about attention.
Yeah, I love that. And it's funny because in Pixels in Place years and years ago, 10 years ago now, I wrote that you could use a functional definition of home is where you're most in control of your own experiences. So that seems like a very relevant tie-in to what you're describing there. The experience of consuming and listening to and listening for in music. It also reminds me that for years I've said that one of the reasons I don't listen to classical music as much is because I cannot turn off, and I didn't have the vocabulary of listening for, but that attention, that sense of like, I can't have it as background music because I'm so drawn to what technically is going on in the music, and it never just sits in the background for me. Yeah. But that's a really important vocabulary bit, it seems to me.
Yeah, and classical music is changing so much. It's very dynamic, both in volume and in the evolution of passages. So it doesn't have a steady state quality, which is much better for doing something else. And there's lots of forms of jazz, lots of forms of EDM, lots of forms of electronica that I have in the background all the time as a kind of a mood setter. But classical is like either you can't hear it or it's blasting you with some fortissimo passage. And I don't listen to classical at home a whole lot. but I do try to attend it live as much as possible. It's
Yeah,
really
that's
works there. Yeah.
great point. But I also, this seems like a really great segue into, talking about musical diet, which you sort of already alluded to
Hmm.
a little bit. And the notion of you borrowed Michael Pollan's nutritional mantra, right? Eat food, not too much, mostly plants, and offered your own musical version. Do you remember the quote of that? Exactly how you
Let's
word it?
see. Listen to a variety and abundance of music with a attentiveness or something like that, and curiosity, or it was something in that
Made
realm.
by people who put art before commerce is what I
That's the
quoted here.
finale, made by people who put art before commerce. Right. Yeah.
And I love that. So from your vantage point, what is broken or inadequate about our current musical diet? And if someone wanted a healthier and more intentional musical life diet, what might that actually look like?
Oh, it's such a good question. And I really tried to avoid being the scoldy old guy in this who's like, you should listen to you people, you've blown off our most important music and you're all wasting your minds with this pop crap. I'm not that guy. This is something these trends have been done to us, not with our consent, not with our involvement. It has not been a democratic system, and this began with the consolidation of corporate radio. I'm blessed to have been alive during the heyday of freeform FM, and I know from study that music was reached people in such a wild variety of ways through the 20th century when America was creating the greatest musical culture that has ever been on the planet. It was the 20th century America is insanely rich and a kind of Renaissance level accomplishment. So, despite all that quality and variety, corporate consolidated radio began to divide the audience into demographic groups and wanted to corral those groups into different stations so that they could be sold products that reached them. And that was, and then that carried over to some degree. Now in streaming, we're not being, I pay for it so I don't get advertised to by the streamer, but there was a kind of a similar push toward not using those platforms, especially Spotify, the big dog, to help you grow as a musical consumer, but to send you, the audience, to playlists which had been curated by, first it was more of a democratic playlist. It was people posting their own, and regular people could become very influential by having a playlist that hit. Then Spotify wanted to control the playlist more. And then we read in Liz Pelly's book of last year, a great expose about how they were not just corralling people to playlists that Spotify had built, but that Spotify had seeded with a lot of work for hire music that was sound alike, thereby kind of anesthetizing the sensitivity of the listener and pushing them into a lean back, quote unquote, air quotes, listening posture so that they wouldn't turn it off. And the more they listened to the work for hire records amongst the legit albums that had been released, those are records they don't have to pay royalties on. So it was another case of putting profit before variety, before quality. It's turning a farmer's market into a mega market. It's the homogenization that's affected so many things in our world. Major labels, they've come and gone. Major labels, I never really want to blame the major labels. They've given us unbelievable gifts over a century, and they're still putting out fantastic music. There is some cynicism inside that industry. I believe that independent labels, which are thriving and have been thriving all through my career covering music, are giving us a variety. But the evidence shows us, I'll land this plane, the evidence shows from the RIAA streaming numbers that that music made of only sound, we'll use jazz and classical as the proxies for that, the music made with instrumentalism and at its forefront, they have dwindled from a good chunk of the music diet of the country in the 20th century, and household names like Leonard Bernstein and Jascha Heifetz and Beverly Sills and Miles Davis and John Coltrane, they are down to like about 2 to 2.5% of all music streamed. And to me, that just shows that's not a natural state for the human race, for Americans with these great traditions and these great artistry. And so I feel like that's a bit of a crisis, which has been some tech, some marketing, and some capitalism, and you gotta rough a thing where people really have to take charge of their own musical destiny.
Yeah, and I love that you're already starting to paint the picture for us of the ecosystem that has to be understood in order to understand the progression that we're talking about over the last decades. You talked about corporate consolidation. You talked about the labels, even though you're not ascribing blame to them per se, they're definitely part of this ecosystem and the picture to be understood. But one of the other pieces you talk about in the book is you spend time disentangling genres from formats, country as a century-long musical tradition versus country, quote unquote, as a radio or playlist format, and revisiting the history of categories like hillbilly and race records. And on this show, we talk a lot about how classification systems encode values. And so I wonder if you might have something to add there about what you wish people understood more about how musical categories are made and used, and how that shapes who gets heard and who never even shows up in the feed.
Great. Yeah. Um, it is so interesting to be in Nashville all these years. And it's been, one would notice that if somebody says, I love country music, I hate country music, then you have to investigate that. You can't take that at face value because it doesn't mean anything. Do you mean you do not like Hank Williams, Lefty Frizzell, Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, and Merle Haggard? Or do you not like Cole Swindell and Luke Bryan and what's on the radio, but you do like country music? So there's this split happened in I'd say the late 90s. I began to go from a new lover of country radio in the 90s to hearing tracks that felt to me much more pop, and then the radio consolidation put country in most major markets in the era that I really covered the industry, the early 2000s, into a suburban mom demographic. They wanted to sell suburban mom products to suburban moms in their cars, driving their kids to and from school and soccer practice. So the music reflected that. Johnny Cash, and it was out, and Rascal Flatts was in. It was in Lone Star. It was mellower. It was sweeter. It was more adult contemporary pop. So that's what happens. There's this, so you have a history of country music turning from a tradition and a genre into a format. And we musical people still, I hope, value genres. Genres are not they're not fake. They're not imposed to put artists in boxes. They're just a taxonomy that helps people communicate about music so that you're at least in the same ballpark. If you're talking about, as I did, I wrote about this in detail in a profile of Esperanza Spalding, who wouldn't engage me on the subject of genre because she has pop elements. She's a jazz composer with an upright bass. She sings a kind of classical American song format, but she's also influenced by hip hop. And she would say, I don't think about genre. And I wanted to say, I'm not asking you to put yourself in the genre category, but to acknowledge in a sense that the blending and merging of these genres is what's exciting. And to be an astute listener over time, you'll become somebody who is able to say about an Esperanza Spalding, oh, I hear this kind of pop influence from the 1960s, and I hear this hip hop influence, and I hear soul from the era of the neo-soul Fugees kind of time of music. So, I'm getting a little bit in the weeds, but genre is a world of weeds, but it's a world where well, as I say, we don't want to go forward without taxonomy about scientific things or about animals. Mammals are different than reptiles, and we are empowered by having these categories. But knowing sort of where your genre histories come from is part of musicality. Knowing the story of jazz and things like that.
Yeah, I also, it seems really important to connect the dots here where you have an article that you wrote in 2021 called Musical Malaise by Design, right? And in that article, you're talking about the big streaming services that haven't really evolved their interfaces since about 2010. And you get into this lean back listening and the promoted passive consumption and all that. But I also feel like there's a dot to connect with this discussion we're just evolving out of around genre and format, and the fact that the streaming platforms rely on a kind of consistency of metadata, and there being taxonomies around all that metadata, and that feeds into the structured algorithmic optimization that can happen in those feeds and for that lean back listening and so on. Can you walk us through the argument that you were looking at back in the Musical Malaise by Design essay, and some of the specific design choices, like around playback and album view and credits and discovery, that sort of thing, that you think are actually stunting musicality rather than supporting it?
Yeah, two landmarks that I think, one pretty bad and one pretty good. The pretty bad one was the very origin of the first digital platform we all got was iTunes, and Apple created a taxonomy where every track was put into boxes called song, title, album that it came from, and artist. Mm-hmm. That works pretty well for pop music. Almost every piece of pop music can be attributed to an album, to a song, and to an artist. It's called, but it works poorly for classical music. And they knew this at the time, and they admitted it that they knew it at the time because Apple released Apple Classical Music as an app, for standalone app, about 4 years ago. And it does a much better job of accommodating the fact that this is a world without songs. It has movements and symphonies, and it has short works and long works. It has operas, and it has opus numbers, and it has catalog numbers, things like that. So I'm not saying I know what the perfect design would have been, but they definitely marginalized classical music from the get-go. And in some ways they did jazz as well, because there's no real artist in jazz. There's a name on a record who's a leader, but all of the players, to the jazz fan like myself, matter. It's not the band supporting one person. It's a 5 or 6 person or a 10-person group with a common cause, and everybody has a voice. So that has still dogged us all these years. It's kind of erased those non-popular formats and genres. The more exciting one was the algorithmic learning of what people liked and could listen to, and recommendations. It's a two-edged sword, though. Mm-hmm. If you teach it that you are a narrow listener, it will treat you as a narrow listener. And if you teach it that you are a omnivore, a musical excited omnivore, always looking, it will hit you with some great stuff. And I remember vividly, I think Pandora set the tone for this, and they set a high bar with what they called the Music Genome Project. And it's got a lot of details. It's not worth going into how they designed it. It was much more human designed. It was much more human curated and human coded. But it
had a lot of nuanced attributes, right? That were understood about every piece of music.
Yes. Quite a wild story, in fact, one that gets forgotten. But I remember a moment where it played something back when I did listen to Pandora regularly that I went, holy man, what is that? Ran over to it, and I learned about this Nels Cline playing in his own instrumental ensemble. It's like, I think I know who Nels Cline is. Oh yeah, he's the guitar player in Wilco. Okay, check. What's he doing playing this trippy, angular, fun, twisty music? And I'd say that by and large, even Spotify's algorithm, very good, very good. And today I listen to Tidal and a platform called Rune, which I would love to talk about from this point of view, this user interface place. These algorithms are quite good. But the user interface, if I may, I mean, you've probably had a lot of experience with this in terms of websites that have to deliver a message and be functional for companies, for nonprofit institutions. My wife's Chinese food market is a kind of a wonder world of discovery as you connect through ingredients and recipes and stories on the blog and things like that. So we don't have that in music. Almost nobody using Apple Music, Spotify, Tidal. These are just like static platforms that have looked the same for 15 more years, right? And there's only one product that I think has transcended and gone to where I expected more innovation on that frontier too, right? in the 2000s, late 2000s, maybe 8, 9, 10, there were digital music summits here in Nashville. And I remember vividly major label executives promising the audience liner notes in the digital online space, in the streaming space, what is then the download moving into the streaming space. We will have these great archival experiences, museum quality, and it never happened. Nobody ever thought it was worth the investment because everybody thought that's only for those 2.5% of the music listening public that would care, without realizing that those 2%, 3%, whatever, that niche of super fans, they are the ones, your best ambassadors. That's the people who spread their love of whatever genre. And I guarantee you, Billy Strings started with those 1 or 2%, right? And if I may just wrap this up, this product I use on a day-to-day basis for the last 5 years is called Roon, ROON, Roon Labs Online.
And you wrote a piece, a follow-up, a piece called Living with Roon. You sort of sketched the almost opposite vision to what you're describing there, right?
Yeah, its strengths are hyperlinked names. Well, let's start with bios for everybody and a bios for every significant album. They are drawn from Wikipedia and drawn from All Music Guide, but they're put right there in the interface while you're listening. And you can look at it at your phone, your tablet, or your computer. It's also built with high audiophile quality music in mind. But each of the bios, this is the genius of it, every name in there is hyperlinked. So if Miles Davis played in a quintet with Herbie Hancock, Herbie Hancock's name is Blue. I click there, I'm at Herbie's world. Then I can go deep. Everything is connecting dots and jumping. It's kind of like it's liner notes on steroids. And it created a metaphor for what I and my generation used to learn our way through realms of music like jazz and roots music. Connections, who played with whom and when. Oh, I recognize that player. You begin to get affection for drummers and bass players that way. So Roon is an amazing product, and only 100,000 or so people use it. It doesn't connect with the big streamers. I hope they do with Apple, because now that Apple has uncompressed music and sounds good. But it's a whole world of people, the consumer, not knowing what they don't know, and it's been costly.
Yeah, and it also relates to another conversation that often comes up in these discussions on this show, is that it's really about the incentives that you are creating and optimizing for. And if you're saying, well, the liner notes or this deep linking is only going to be of interest to 1 to 2 to 3% of fans, then what you're saying is there's no incentive to grow that base. There's no incentive to create more of those super fans or that deep fandom. And that seems like a missed opportunity. That seems like, someone not recognizing that there's a whole opportunity that gets opened up by creating that deep fandom.
Yeah, and I work so closely with bluegrass. It's probably the world that I've inhabited more than any other, and it's one of my great passions. And it's such a healthy ecosystem that doesn't engage in that kind of filtering. Filtering based on, well, who's popular now, so give the people more Billy Strings or more Alison Krauss. It is this cycling, and the musicians engage in it from the stage very often. I learned this song from Larry Sparks. Larry Sparks is amazing. You should listen to him too. Billy Strings has been talking about Doc Watson, who's deceased and one of my great influences and heroes, for years. And so bluegrass sets an example for how it can be done while also celebrating the leading lights. They give awards, and they do, if you listen to bluegrass radio on Sirius XM, for example, you're going to hear the top artists in the 20% of the time. But it's not an 80-20 thing. It's like the vast majority is new music and important historic music, and it doesn't seem to privilege the new over the tradition, and it's a really beautiful thing to watch. And so I know it's possible, right, to do it at an industrial scale, at a corporate. It's a business, it's a sector, and it does it really well.
It's fantastic. I think it was really important for us to cover that much ground in order to really set the stage, kind of understand the ecosystem, the components that we're talking about. because I also want to make sure that before we close out, we really come full circle to this moment around AI, the current cultural moment. There's just a piece in The Atlantic, we'll make sure to include in show notes, about whether we might be in the new disco sucks moment, a backlash around authenticity in music, with a Geese and Chaotic Good story, where a marketing firm talks openly about trend simulation, seeding content and quasi fan accounts to push a band into TikTok's algorithms. So against that backdrop of opaque feeds and bots and deepfakes and a lot of generalized mistrust, what does authenticity mean to you right now in music? And what do you like wish listeners would pay attention to or insist on when they decide what's real and worth their attention?
Right. Yeah, people need to be really attentive, hyper aware, and I do believe that people are sort of, how do I say people, the general public, whatever word we want to use. There is a widespread consciousness raising going on right now about being more on guard. The level of viral marketing that has been, kind of fabricated from beneath a sort of astroturf kind of vibe around bands. This is an extension of what's been going on for a long time. Payola at radio, the creation of mystique around artists. This has been manufactured for a while. I'm not terribly scared of it. It just happens at scale now, and it happens very fast, and it happens at the level of the phone, where people are kind of getting a lot of subliminal information really quick, so they can implant ideas about an artist. I think that once they listen, they'll make a realistic decision about whether they like it or not. Very different than the new realm, the new industry of generative AI songs. Text prompt to produce something that I call a simulacrum of music. And I think people need to be just really averse to this. I mean, like Ebola virus averse. There's no gain. I've thought about it. And while there are some interesting techniques and tools, I do think that I can see it being interesting. I've heard people demo a song, they write it themselves, they write the chords, they write the melody, and they play it into a microphone, and they give it to Suno, which is one of the two big companies, and they get to hear it back as if arranged in a recording studio with the band, and they can iterate it as a country song or a pop song or so forth. I would like to think that people could imagine that in their mind's ear, and I think we can, and I think we should make sure we hold on to that skill and develop that skill. And in Nashville, songwriters are sending AI-generated demos of songs they definitely wrote, but then they make a demo and then they give it they pass around the tape. And so people in Nashville used to get hired to play demo sessions. That's crushing their work, and that's a real cost we're paying in town right now. But it also led to the old analog, real life demos. Put real musicians in the studio who had an interface and interchange with these lyrics and this melody and these chord changes, and created little hooks, little ideas, little things that then carried on to the master recording and that often became a hit. I do think that those little accidents, those happy accidents, are going to get inserted as generated by a computer somewhere between the pure songwriter and the final record that may have been recorded by real instruments and real musicians. But why tempt fate? Why go down that slippery slope is my sort of number one. There's just no upside. I don't think that this is a system that needs to be made more efficient. This is a world where this is a creative art where friction and time and patience and iterating is good for everybody and for the final product. It's good for the musical professional community. It makes musicians more astute. And I'm sure you've seen this where in executive level hiring decisions, corporate hiring decisions, they think they can replace entry level jobs with AI, and functionally they may be able to do so, but then they're like, well, how can we hire somebody good for this middle position? And they're like, well, wait, we forgot to train everybody in our corporate culture, our way to do things, and nobody has come through come through the rigmarole of those first 3 to 5 years of work. And that's irreplaceable. So you see a backlash, you see a response to that. And so I think that I see that backlash happening in the musical fan world. And I think that will creep into the more passive fan-based music where even younger people are going to just go, is that AI or not? They're going to ask that question. And I think they should.
Yeah, I think that's, again, two different directions I want to go with my follow-up here, because for one thing, I don't know how many of my listeners to this show know that in one of my past lives living in Nashville, I was writing songs and getting them demoed. And to your point, the whole notion, the whole experience of bringing a rough cut demo that into a studio and having these working session players work it out and record it is one of the most fascinating things to witness. Truly, in my whole life, it's been one of the most fascinating things to witness, because here's these guys that are coming in, and mostly guys, but a mix of genders. I'll just say guys, because in all of my experiences, it's been an entire room of men. Yeah. They're coming in off of, supporting Reba McEntire on the road, or Alan Jackson, or whoever they're out on tour with, and they haven't seen each other in a while, and they're all just gabbing as they're tuning their instruments, and the rough cut demo is playing in the background. The engineer is playing it for them to kind of hear as they're just setting up. It plays through once, and then they record it. You have such a deep musical vocabulary of, having heard the song once, they know absolutely how to play this song. And moreover, they can be interacting with you as a songwriter and going like, oh, I love how you brought that Kansas-like riff into the bridge there. They have this like really rich vocabulary of references and shared understanding of where these kind of origins are and what dips over into what. And that seems, to your point, that seems like such a loss to, not be able to support that and cultivate it. And people, not everybody has gotten to experience that, but I can tell you from experience that there's been very few times in my life I've ever witnessed that much professional competence on display and just sheer ability to cut through in one take, and then the engineer goes, everybody happy with that? And they go around the room, and the bass player might go, I'd like to go in at measure 12 and just do one thing, re-record one measure. And the whole thing is over, and like the song is 3.5 minutes long, they're done in under 10 minutes. It's astonishing how good these people are at their jobs. So the idea that AI could replace that and displace that is maybe not frightening, but it does strike me as something to grieve and feel some sense of loss over.
I think it's something to actively fight against. I've not come across a kind of tech moral question so stark and so, to me, obvious in a long time. Where the line is between using certain AI tools to help you in a mixer, a mastering session, there's tools, but if you are starting to be tempted to replace your own imagination and your own creative impulse with even like, oh, give me a prompt. If you think maybe I'm crossing a line, maybe you probably are, and you were witnessing in those sessions deeply human moments, professionalism, as you said, but also mutual respect. The kind of, those people can't work that way without knowing each other and having a good hang and having fun. Cowboy Jack said, music is the fun business. If you're not having fun, you're not doing it right. So AI music ain't fun.
No, it's not. And I've had some very intriguing conversations with people who fall along different places on the spectrum of either being, sort of pro-adoption of AI as a creative act, sort of using it experimentally as an artist, versus those who completely resist and say, it's something to be actively fought against. I think there's room for a range of interpretations, but I think it's worth sort of zooming out and reflecting that we are living through this really conflicted moment around AI right now, around trust, around truth. And then to your point, I think part of what the issue is that we're not necessarily being given the story straight, right? Like it isn't necessarily being made clear to us where things are being fabricated, literally like made versus lied about, versus kind of sort of positioned as if it's something that it isn't.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I have been using this word that I want people to have as a watchword, and that is provenance, knowing where knowing from whence a work came. If you can't find out something about that person, their artist, their history, that they're a human that grew up in a town with influences, trace it back to its origin point is the best way to know you're not being duped, and to carry that provenance as a part of musicality with you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the bigger story too around trust and truth is, I think about your work, and you wrote about how musical literacy has eroded, but how so much rich music is one click away, and yet most of us aren't clicking. But you also tie music to empathy, to civil rights history, and to the fact that authoritarians so often fear or try to control it. And that seems like a really important
Yeah.
line to connect here, dots to connect with a
Yeah.
through line.
Yeah, I remember hearing one of the sort of talking head propagandist right wing types years ago. I won't name who it is, but I thought that is the most unmusical thing I've ever heard. It was this fraudulently posturing, cynical manipulation. And I thought, wow, that's like the opposite of music. Music is presenting a aura of beauty and at least intrigue, doing it through sound, which is a very penetrating medium and sense that we possess. And in fact, music was many of the things that have been developed about music and into music were designed around the way we evolved as hearing beings. Two ears, left and right, but we're binaural, for just to name one. And yeah, when had this sort of flash, so I do say in the book that I see authoritarianism as kind of the cosmic opposite of music and musicality. Musicality is a leveling is you use democratic, got a point of view and posture on your fellow men and women, and it is a great tool to take into this crazy future. Music is a wonderful. It's actionable, and there's so much of it there, whether it's recorded or live in your local town tonight, or making plans to go travel to see a great work at a symphony hall in a big city. There's so many ways in which we can activate it, and the times really call on us to do that.
Yeah, yeah. You're already getting us there. I do love closing out these conversations with like one last thought that comes in a hopeful way, and you're already there. But I wonder, like, if we treat music as not just entertainment, but as a kind of civic or democratic practice, what role do you think it can play in helping us stay human and stay connected in a culture that often feels fragmented and manipulated? And so on that hopeful note, when you're looking at music and listening in this moment, what is giving you hope right now as you think about that through line of that connection and culture?
I see a lot of growth in the genres that I love, which are very music forward and very nurturing of their audiences: bluegrass, jazz, experimental. I think that we're coming back. I think that the real nadir for all that was like right around 99, 2000, and the birth of the height of corporate programmed radio. And I think that there's been a backlash ever since. The vinyl revival is a real wonderful thing, a widespread acknowledgement that there's more than the ephemeral digital playback and having it choose for us, it's part of the active role. And to conclude on a very practical, almost mundane, but I think important note that anybody could do, a step I would like people to take, is to think about what they listen to and how they listen at home. Separate your listening environment from your TV environment, or at least build it so that the TV is not always the center of attention. There is the conversations about audio, stereos, hi-fi. Boy, those got really bogged down in a lot of baggage. Unfortunately, a lot of that baggage created by white middle-aged men like myself, who couldn't figure out a way to talk about high-fidelity audio without coming off like snobs who spend a lot of money and are really proud of it. But there's this wonderful tech movement, which some have called future fi, where instead of big multi-component systems, the components have been shrunk down to two boxes: active speakers, meaning they have amplifiers built into them, and a box that connects to your Wi-Fi or your Ethernet cable at home and translates the bits to analog music that it must be to drive a speaker. That process is so bad in so many ways. The Bluetooth or the plug-in on the bottom of your phone, a good converter from the original source, coming from Apple Music, for example, to the signal that drives the speakers is really key. And there are brands like WIM, which have very affordable $400, $500 box to a pair of $300 speakers. It's no longer something where you have to go and invest a lot of money. But I like to tell people that your stereo is not just a piece of consumer electronics. It is a musical instrument, and it should be thought of that way. It should be built to last. It should come from a reputable maker that puts real care, made by music lovers. And you'll find that has resonance and authenticity of sound, a truth in the timbral quality. A violin sounds like a violin. Cymbals sound like cymbals. You really want that authenticity, because until you've heard it, then you don't need a video feed. You don't need to scroll. You don't need to do other stuff while you listen, that there's suddenly enough information, authentic sound, to make you, oh, this is enough. Listening to Ella Fitzgerald sing from way back when, or listening to Billie Eilish right now. All those records were made with such care. It's insane how much information there is in those recordings. It's crazy. To listen on $1 million stereo system, you're like, that was in there? It can be had, a great approximation, for $1,000. And it's the best $1,000 you could spend in your nest, your place where you get to choose the music and go on your own adventure. So that's my little benediction for folks.
I love it. Thank you so much, Craig. You've really given us a lot to think about and to get reconnected to our love of music and our love of musicality. Where can folks find you and your work online, Craig?
So my long, complicated name is CraigHavighurst.com. That also connects to Musicality for Humans, FOR, Musicality for Humans, .net. And I have a Substack called String Theories.
I love that name. That's fantastic.
All right.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here. Thank you for walking us through this theme. And thanks for sharing your love of music with us all.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you for listening to The Tech Humanist Show. This episode was produced and edited by Thrive Loud Productions, with research by Ashley Robinson and Aaron Daughtry of Interrobang. You can find more information about the show's guests and links to their projects at thetechhumanist.com, where you can also find more episodes, or you can subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Special thanks to all of our guests for lending their voices to help make the future a brighter place. I'm Kate O'Neill. You've been listening to The Tech Humanist Show from KO Insights.